Hello, I'm Marshall Masters, publisher of yowusa.com and the author of Being in It for the Species, The Universe Speaks. Well, we've got a full slate of topics for this Planet X system update, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy them. We'll begin with the non-events of September 2015. On one hand, it was an orchestrated expectation stampede by the elites. But on the other, something amazing did happen that month, and I'll share that with you. Following that, we'll take a look at a stunning image of Nibiru captured in April 2015 by Glenn Vaughan of San Jose, California. It shows us Nibiru's wings for the first time, and you'll see it and the image analysis process I used to validate this powerful image. Then we have a special segment for shelter builders about low-cost solar storm shielding, and you'll want to hear what special guest John Finuzzi has to say about a very affordable and simple way to do that with volcanic basalt. Following that, we'll return to Glenn Vaughan's Nibiru Wings image for another look, as I share with you the reason why I find this image to be deeply disturbing and what it portends for us today. Finally, I'll close with a special message to my brothers and sisters in awareness who may be wondering whether their awareness is a blessing or a curse. So, we've got a lot of topics to cover. Let's get started with this yowusa.com Planet X system update. Okay, folks, September 2015 was a month we'd all like to forget. But before we throw the baby out with the bathwater, I want you to know something really fantastic happened that month. So quickly, let's take a look at the bad news, the good news, and where we go from here. Like Y2K, Comet Elenin in 2011, and the Mayan calendar on December 21, 2012, September 2015 will long be remembered as a month of humiliation for many in awareness. In the lead up to September 2015, hyped up expectations over concerns about the Blood Moon Tetrad, CERN, and the Pope's visit to the U.S. collapsed in a disillusioning month of non-events. This brings us to the September 2015 major prophetic event tally. Nada, niet, zilch, and bupkis. And for those of you who shared your concerns and expectations with others in the months preceding September 2015, you're now hearing, "Oh no, not again," along with another chorus of the denier mantra. It's all nonsense, nothing will happen, and I do not want to hear about it. Well, that was the bad news. Now for the good news. Ever since I founded yowusa.com back in December 1999, we've seen a lot of what I call expectation stampedes. But with this one, we saw something we have never, ever seen before. What we saw in the previous stampedes, Y2K, Comet Elenin, and the Mayan calendar, is people were asking what I call groping questions. They knew they'd been left holding the bag, but didn't understand why, and so their unfocused questions left them groping for answers that never came. We know this because at yowusa.com We routinely track internet chatter and social media, blog sites, comment areas, and so forth, following an expectation stampede. And what we saw this time was new. In the aftermath of September 2015, people all across the internet stopped asking pointless, groping questions and started asking the one question they never asked before, and I might add, with a refreshing, singular clarity of mind. So, what was that new question we heard for the very first time in the aftermath of the September 2015 stampede? The question was, while we were distracted with the blood moon tetrad, CERN, and the Pope's visit to the U.S., what were the elites doing behind our backs? And what did we at yowusa.com think about that? Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Why this made us happy is that expectation stampedes are designed to prevent us from reaching a consensus over our concerns. That is not to say the elites share the same concerns that we do. They do not, and here is why. The first concern of the elites is control of the population, and this makes the internet a thorny issue for them. In places like China, where hordes of internet minders are invading the privacy of Chinese citizens by controlling online conversations, it's easy. If a citizen of China says something that displeases the state and it comes to the attention of an internet minder, they will be arrested and imprisoned. They know that. This is how Chinese elites break the spirit of their people so as to maintain control of the population through the internet. In America, our government is steadily moving towards the Chinese model, and thanks to the United States Supreme Court and the FCC, you can rest assured that will eventually happen. But in the meantime, a more subtle form of control is needed to break our spirits. While this method is being implemented in a modern way, it's nothing more than a high-tech version of a low-tech slaver's whip. This is because when a slave owner has a slave whipped, it is not to break the body, it is to break the spirit, and whether you are using a device made of leather or a computer workstation, the goal is the same. You break a person's spirit. Does this mean you can eliminate a slave's concerns? No. But those concerns will become irrelevant once you've broken the slave's spirit. This is because in doing so, the hopelessness and sense of impotence of a broken spirit will prevent groups of slaves from reaching a consensus and confronting elitist control mechanisms. Now let's talk about you. With regard to the aftermath of September 2015, if you're feeling foolish and humiliated, how does this apply to you? Your concerns are still valid. What failed you were agenda-driven expectations. This is because truth does not reveal itself at the speed of human expectations. Rather, it reveals itself in its own good way and in its own good time. As for the elites, they do not need to create public concerns, as their slaves will do that for them. All they need to do is to break people's spirit, and then they win. How they do it in America is with something I call an expectation stampede, and here is how they do it. Find a public concern with a date-driven expectation. Then amplify that expectation, and interest in the concern will die following a non-event. It's just that simple. A case in point is my interview with National Geographic in August 2012. During that interview about Planet X in the Mayan calendar, the producer asked me, Is there a direct link between Planet X and December 21, 2012? I confidently answered, no, I do not see a direct link. It is just coincidental. Well, my answer was right at the time, but it was also wrong. Very wrong. The answer was right at the time because in the lead up to December 21, 2012, the only empirical data we had was Mayan calendar entertainment revenues. Aside from the hefty cable TV and movie profits, there was nothing to show a direct link between Planet X and December 21, 2012. That was until we revisited this question, asked me in August 2012. Is there a direct link between Planet X and December 21, 2012? We did that in our May 2015 article titled, Were the Mayans Using Anunnaki Knowledge? In that article, we presented post-2012 empirical data that clearly shows a direct link between Planet X and the Mayan calendar date of December 21, 2012. Here you see the empirical data for major earthquakes for the period January 2012 through February 2013. And what we see is a massive statistical spike immediately after December 21, 2012. And when we increased the reporting period for the years 1997 through 2014, this massive statistical spike becomes even more pronounced. Plus, we found similar trends in other data sets as well. Therefore, the Mayan calendar date of December 21, 2012 was not about the end of the world. It was about the end of one calendar and the beginning of the next calendar, which the ancient Mayans knew would be the harbinger of a coming tribulation. So as the result of a misleading expectation stampede, most of us completely missed the significance of December 21, 2012. That it was a harbinger, a warning to us that we now stand at the precipice of a terrible global tribulation. So, was the elitist 2012 expectation stampede successful? Yes, very successful. All you need to do is look around you and see how many people are not preparing for the tribulation to come. The bottom line is that what the other guy does is what the other guy does. What you do is all that matters. And if you are truly in awareness, you must be resolute. With this in mind, I want to play a short series of snippets from a video recently produced by the Hockey Davis channel on YouTube. Excellent channel. I really recommend it. Now, as you watch these snippets, I want you to repeat to yourself again and again the denier's mantra. It's all nonsense. Nothing's going to happen, and I don't want to hear about it. Now, for those of you who have never heard the denier's mantra ever before, let me repeat it for your benefit. It's all nonsense, nothing's going to happen, and I don't want to hear about it. So let's watch that clip. That brings us to a critical question for those of you who may be feeling humiliated and isolated as a result of the September 2015 expectation stampede. Are you ready to throw in the towel because your spirit has been broken? If so, you're not going to be the first, and you certainly are not going to be the last. But that's not the real issue. The real issue is that if you decide to throw in the towel, the consequences will not only affect you, but all of those you love and hold dear as well. This is because we are already living through the 6th major extinction event on this planet. It's called the Holocene extinction. What this extinction event has in common with the previous 5 is that the dominant species does not survive the extinction event, and we are presently the dominant species on planet Earth. However, what makes this extinction very different from all of the previous extinctions is that now there is a target species. We are that species. With this in mind, what does an extinction event look like? To answer this question, let me show you an extinction event through my own life experiences. When I was a young lad of 16, I briefly worked in a McDonald's hamburger restaurant. And yes, I am old enough to remember a time when a small hamburger used to cost 15 cents. My job was to work the counter and to run the artificial milkshake machine. When it came time for my lunch break, I was allowed 1 drink, 1 bag of fries, and my choice of a sandwich. The only sandwich I ever wanted and always ate was the fillet of fish. This is because back then, McDonald's fillet of fish sandwiches were made from codfish. And oh my, how delicious they were. Forget the Big Macs and the cheeseburgers. As far as I was concerned, the fillet of fish sandwich made from codfish was the tastiest sandwich in the store, bar none. Then I recently learned an interesting thing about codfish. They swim deep, and so when the fishermen under contract to McDonald's back when I was a lad were hauling in their nets, they had to be careful to avoid another species which swims above codfish schools, called pollock. In those days, pollock was considered to be an undesirable trash fish because the flesh is more oily than codfish. So the fishermen were careful to set their nets to avoid pollock schools, and if they caught a few, they just threw them back into the sea like any other undesirable trash fish. Consequently, over the years, the cod fisheries were heavily depleted, while the pollock fisheries flourished. But to be honest, as a young lad, I didn't know this. All I knew was that McDonald's fillet of fish sandwiches were fantastic, as did the other customers of this global franchise operation. McDonald's knew that, and so they promoted fillet of fish sandwiches with colorful ads, encouraging us to gobble up as many of these delectable sandwiches as possible. Consequently, demand for fillet of fish sandwiches eventually resulted in a heavy depletion of the codfish species. So how did McDonald's respond to this biodiversity fiasco? Did they respond as responsible stewards of the environment, or as a corporation needing to report a quarterly profit? Instead of spending the money needed to be responsible stewards in helping to restore the codfish species, McDonald's did what investors on Wall Street expected them to do. They abandoned the species they had depleted in favor of one that had been previously ignored, namely pollock. Consequently, when McDonald's tells us, for us, there is only one fish in the sea, Alaska pollock, they're telling the truth, because codfish are no longer commercially viable for them. We, on the other hand, assume that because pollock is the only fish species in the sea for McDonald's, that it must be the tastiest fish species available. In other words, this is yet another example of misleading corporate advertising that only a Wall Street investment banker could love. So, if you're ready to walk away from your awareness and your concerns because you've been humiliated by an expectation stampede, please do one last thing before you decide. Instead of walking away from your awareness, walk to the nearest McDonald's restaurant and order a Filet-O-Fish sandwich. Then, as that 60-something behind the counter who is working there because he or she cannot make it on Social Security alone, hands you your Filet-O-Fish sandwich, ask yourself one simple question. Am I a Homo sapien or am I Homo pollock? This is a relevant question because the elites do not see you as Homo sapien. They see you as Homo pollock, or what they call useless eaters. And how do they control useless eaters? Well, a former Secretary of Defense stated it most succinctly.
Today, it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people. It is easier to kill than to control.
For those of you who are proud to say, I am a Homo sapien and my spirit will not be broken, I want to share with you 3 things you can begin doing today to ensure that you will never again be isolated or humiliated as the result of another expectation stampede. Leave your days of impetuous belief behind and live by the first rule of prophecy. Always be mindful of it, but never live in expectation of it. Remember, an expectation stampede begins when the elites identify a public concern with a date-driven expectation. So if you refuse to live in expectation of a prophecy, then you're automatically immune to these stampedes. And yes, you'll be the proverbial one-eyed king in the land of the blind, and quite unappreciated for it. But on the other hand, never again will you feel like a one-eyed idiot in the land of the deniers. The second thing is to follow the truth wherever it leads, no matter how improbable. God gave us the gift of reason, so use it. If you limit your search for truth to a narrow path between the fence posts of dogma, doctrine, and disbelief, then you're thinking like a Homo pollock. If that's really you, then good luck with it. And most importantly, always ask God for wisdom. Ignore those chicken little soothsayers with their snappy sound bites and shallow substance. And be especially leery of angry demagogues who do an eloquent job of whipping people into a frenzy and then leaving them hanging without any real solutions. In fact, you would be wise to remember that angry demagogues are more likely to be serving the interests of the elite than your own. So when talking to God, always remember this. When you ask God for wisdom, you must have the patience to listen. In other words, don't say, God, I need an answer within the next 5 minutes because the big game is about to come on. Rather, schedule a daily distraction-free quiet listening time when you can still your mind with a meditative state and then be patient. The answer will eventually come. Not with fanfare and snappy music, but rather it will come as the small voice within that prophets and sages have set their compasses by for thousands of years. Also, if you're a yowusa.com subscriber and you're looking for a way to talk with God about surviving the coming tribulation, I recommend my interview series with author Susan Shumsky titled Life and Death in a Global Catastrophe. I recorded these cut-to-the-chase shows specifically for this reason, so please check them out. Next up, I will be presenting an image of Nibiru captured in 2015 of this year that I find to be deeply disturbing. Image analysts like Richard Shaw of Pinlight Productions and myself receive a continuous stream of emails from people with photographs of what they believe to be Planet X. 90% of these just simply are, they're not worth our time to answer, and so we don't. The 10% where people really do appreciate and value our time and don't want to waste it, we do respond to them, and we're thankful for their concern. But what we're really looking for is that 1 in 100 person who sends us something that's really worth our time. Such was the case in August of this year. An image was submitted to me by Mr. Glenn Vaughan of San Jose, California. He took this picture with a high-quality digital camera while flying to South America back in April of this year. He sent me a lot of good information along with that image, and I was immediately impressed. This man valued my time, and so I put the time into it to analyze his picture, and I liked what I saw. And so I asked him if he would step forward with an interview on Skype that I could present in this video. He agreed. I'm going to present to you that video interview with Glenn and then my analysis. Before investing time into a serious analysis of any image sent to us, such as Glenn's, we test the submission using the following 5 analysis rules. First, legitimate observers must come forward with a full account of their observation. If you're not willing to step forward and put your face on it, neither will I. Second, we only accept digital camera stills with a minimum resolution of 200 dpi, or dots per inch. They must also be taken with a camera that has a good optic lens, and you must provide the original raw file. This is why we always ask, what camera did you take the picture with, so we can research the camera's lens. Please note, we do not accept smartphone stills because the latest generation of smartphones often generate false positive objects of interest. The third rule applies to what we call 72 dpi video reports. With this resolution, only video observations are useful. We prefer HDV videos, but smartphone videos are okay. Also, 72 dpi video observations with voice narration are especially helpful. So why is it we only accept stills with 200 dpi or better, but will accept 72 dpi videos? It's a matter of resolution. DPI stands for dots per inch, and it is critical to digital analysis. To illustrate the point, at the top of this illustration, you see an increasing dots per inch comparison. On the far left, you see a dot pattern similar to what we saw with early cell phone cameras in the 90s. On the far upper right, the resolution is comparable to modern cameras. However, when you look at the illustration below, what you see is that whether you are using a smartphone or an incredibly expensive high-definition camera, both will generate the same still image result, 72 dpi. And this resolution is unacceptable for credible still image analysis. Also, to the bottom right, you see a 300 dpi sample. This is important because any book sold with a color cover requires the print image to be a minimum of 300 dpi. However, for our analysis purposes, any digital image with a resolution of 200 dpi or more is adequate. The fourth rule is that images shot through glass home or auto windows are not acceptable. We get a lot of these, and they are of no interest to us. This is because auto and home windows often create unwanted glare or reflections, and water spots and mud are also a problem. This is why many aquarium makers use plexiglass instead of glass, not only for its greater relative strength, but also because it offers less glare and increased clarity, which brings us to the fifth rule. Images shot through plexiglass aircraft windows are acceptable. This is because modern passenger jet windows are constructed with triple layers of plexiglass. Plexiglass is not glass. It is a plastic that is as transparent as the finest optical glass. Consequently, it offers greater relative strength than glass, along with less glare and increased clarity. Now, while most of us do not walk around with high-quality digital cameras or HDV video cameras, most of us do have a good quality smartphone. So what I want to show you is a recent smartphone video posted on YouTube by Melissa Huffman. As we have not interviewed her, this is not a verified report. So I am only presenting it to illustrate some of the things you can do to make your smartphone videos more useful for researchers. So now let's take a look at Melissa's video.
Okay, so here I am out here in September, and as you can see, there's obviously a really very clear planet that is right north of the sun. And wow, I would love to say it was the moon, but since the moon happens to be right here on the opposite side, there's no way it is. And since we all have been taught in school that Mercury and Venus do not show up, oh, just look at that planet just beaming and shining right now. Somebody tell me what it is. Thank you.
There are three things that I want to point out in Melissa's video that are valuable to anyone submitting a smartphone report. They are provenance, confirmation, and details. In this first clip, we'll see an example of provenance, a term that means the chronology of the ownership, custody, or location of a historical object.
Okay, so here I am out here in September.
In this video shot by Melissa Huffman, she doesn't say exactly when she took this video, but she does note it is in September, which the viewer must assume is September of this year. On her YouTube channel, she says it was taken from the Sanibel Causeway, which is in Florida, and that she saw it with a friend. So the provenance of this video observation is, well, it's uncertain, which means it's really not that useful. However, what is interesting is how much coverage it is getting on the internet. The second thing you need to keep in mind is confirmation. You've got to tell the viewer what you're seeing with your own eyes. And then pay particular attention to the object of interest. Let's take a look at this next clip to see an example of confirmation.
And as you can see, there's obviously a really very clear planet that is right north of the sun.
Here, Melissa does a good job of confirmation by telling us that the object of interest is north of the sun. As an aside, this is a good way to spot disinformation on the internet. Beware of people who, instead of confirming what they're seeing with their own eyes, tell you, just look at this, you'll see it. In other words, if you get an unconfirmed image or video from someone unknown to you, 9 times out of 10, you're being spoofed by a paid disinformationalist. That brings us to the third thing you must do when capturing video of an object of interest. Include the details.
And wow, I would love to say it was the moon, but since the moon happens to be right here on the opposite side, there's no way it is. And since we all have been taught in school that Mercury...
Here's where I give Melissa Huffman a gold star for detail. She not only shows us the moon to demonstrate that it is not the object of interest north of the sun, but she also does it without starting and stopping her video capture. In other words, once you hit the record button, keep recording continuously until you are finished. And always remember, folks, the more information you can give us, the better. No matter how insignificant or obscure it may seem, report it and describe it in detail. Next up, we're going to see my Skype video interview with Glenn Vaughan regarding the image of Nibiru he captured in April of this year. Please note this original image is available on our site for all yowusa.com subscribers. You may freely share it with others, but do not post it on any corporate sites that claim copyright on uploads, such as Facebook. Following that, we'll do a step-by-step image analysis of Glenn's photo so that you can do it on any image in the privacy of your own home. This is Marshall, and I'm on with Glenn Vaughan. Glenn resides in San Jose, California area, and we are looking at an image that he submitted to us that he had taken on April 11, 2015 of a sunset while he was flying along the Pacific side of Central America. And Glenn, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and then tell us about how you came to take this picture?
Well, I'm a retired college professor, taught at White Pacific University for 10 years in Honolulu. Also owned a couple computer stores. I taught systems analysis at the graduate level. And later I taught digital photography at a senior center. So I have some experience in the photography area.
Okay. And tell us about this day. What flight were you taking? And from where did you originate and what was your destination?
Originated from San Jose Airport and flew to Dallas, Fort Worth. From Dallas, flew across the isthmus into the Pacific Ocean. And this was taken about 4:11 or closer to 5 o'clock actually.
Okay.
At, probably off of Costa Rica.
Mm-hmm. And so that you were fully at altitude, approximately 30,000 feet?
Yeah.
And what kind of jet were you flying in?
It's American Airlines.
Okay. All right. Wide body?
Yeah.
All right. And so you were looking at the sunset, just enjoying it for its natural beauty, as I recall.
That is correct.
And how long were you looking out to the west as the aircraft was headed south, and just admiring the sunset?
Well, I had a window seat. I was looking out at the sunset for about 30 minutes before I took this picture.
Okay. And during that time, did you happen to observe any other aircraft in the vicinity that were to the west of your American airliner?
No.
Okay. So at no time did you see any other aircraft?
No.
All right. And then uneventful trip, obviously. That's good. When did you come to the realization you had captured this object in the image?
I was at my daughter's house making an oil painting of the sunset, and I saw it.
Okay. And so when you saw that, and you said earlier you had been a former, you had taught digital photography and you were a systems analyst. By the way, that's what I did in the Silicon Valley. I was a systems analyst until I retired. And so I guess as one analyst to another, what caught your attention to this, and why did you see this as a second object next to the sun?
One of the interesting things is I've been following on the web, including your website, about Nibiru, and I recall that one of your contacts also had seen it in a similar area flying an aircraft. So that's what began my thought. Then I noticed the wings on the side of it, and I said, that's got to be it. And so then I sent you the photo.
Okay. And did you do any analysis of this object yourself?
No,
Okay. But you did send us a 20 megapixel raw file. What was the camera that you used to capture that image with?
it was a Sony camera, small camera.
Okay. Small digital camera?
Yes.
Okay. And so, as you look at it now, I'm going to show my viewers how we analyze the image as I've shown it to you.
3 of our 5 rules apply to Glenn's image. He satisfied the first rule by stepping forward and giving us this report. And he satisfied the 5th rule because he took the picture through a plexiglass aircraft passenger window. That brings us to the second rule. Glenn did send us the original high-resolution RAW file from his camera. RAW files contain valuable metadata, and viewing that metadata is simple. For Windows users, it's a 4-step process. Step 1. From File Explorer or your desktop, select the image. Step 2. Right-click the mouse. This will display a context menu. Step 3. From the context menu, select Properties. This will display the Properties dialog. And Step 4. On the Properties dialog, select the Details tab, and there you will see the metadata. Keep in mind that the metadata shown will vary from one camera to another. In this case, Glenn's camera provided a substantial level of metadata, and the very first thing we looked for was the resolution. Here in the metadata for Glenn's RAW file, we see that his camera created the image with a 240 dpi resolution in both horizontal and vertical resolutions. More than enough to satisfy our minimum resolution requirement of 200 dpi. Now, the other part of that requirement is the lens. The metadata also told us that the image was taken with a Sony DSC HX50V. This camera retails for about $400 and sports an impressive 30x optical zoom Sony G lens. More than enough to satisfy our optics requirement. So let's quickly summarize the other metadata. Here we see the date and time the image was captured and the GPS coordinates recorded by the camera. And here we see the exposure information along with the image dimensions, which are quite impressive for such a small camera. At this point, Glenn has satisfied our rules. And so the next step is to see if any catalog celestial objects were in the field of view when the image was captured. For field of view studies, you can use free astronomy programs such as Stellarium or Google Sky, along with the free version of Solar System Scope. We use Starry Night Professional version 6 and Solar System Scope Professional. So let's see what turned up in our field of view analysis for Glenn's image. This is the field of view for Glenn's image according to Starry Night Professional, and we do see Mercury, a cataloged object, above the Sun. To see if Mercury is in a superior conjunction behind the Sun or an inferior conjunction in front of the Sun, we use Solar System Scope as a quick reference tool. Here, Solar System Scope tells us Mercury was in a superior conjunction behind the Sun that day. So if Glenn had taken his picture later on as the Sun was sinking below the horizon, we may have seen Mercury as it appears here in this picture of Venus and Mercury taken a few years ago. When you compare the relative size of Mercury with Venus in this picture, it's clear to see that our object of interest is not Mercury, nor does Mercury have wings. At this point, we knew Glenn's image merited further analysis, and the next step in the process is what we call a gamma test. It's a simple test, but it's a very valuable test, and we're going to show you how it's done. You're now going to learn how to perform a do-it-yourself gamma test. This is easy, and it's a great way to acid test any image. All you need is a freely available paint program such as GIMP, which allows you to adjust size, contrast, brightness, and gamma. We'll talk more about gamma later on, but for now what you need to remember is that gamma shows us if an object is hot or cold. This is critical because hot objects generate their own light and cold objects do not. So why is this important? Natural objects like our Sun are hot objects. They create the light we're seeing through camera lenses. On the other hand, lens flares and other aberrations are cold objects. They do not create their own light. Rather, they redirect it from other sources that do create light. So the whole point of a gamma test is to factor out misleading cold objects, so we can focus our attention on the hot objects. Ergo, gamma testing separates cold objects from hot objects. But it's not an absolute test, because there are other things in our skies that can skew this test. Case in point are geoengineering aerosols. We found that the particulates in those aerosols can create cloud reflections, which appear to the untrained eye as a second sun. Worse yet, these aerosols often create false positives in the latest generation of smartphones. Just remember our 5 rules of image analysis and you'll be able to factor in these kinds of aberrations. Then as you go along and begin doing your own gamma tests, your own powers of intuition will lead you into new areas of analysis, and you'd be surprised how quickly you go. The key to developing your own powers of intuition with this is to understand how a digital camera sees the world. Here we see a beautiful picture of the sky, but this is not how a digital camera sees it. To illustrate the point, let's select a very tiny little piece of this picture. Right here should do the trick. Now, let's enlarge this tiny little area to see how a digital camera sees the world. What you see here are what is called pixels. In other words, digital cameras do not see pictures. They see patterns of pixels, and each of these pixels has a certain level of brightness, ranging from black to white. When using a program like Photoshop, you can change these pixels one at a time, or altogether with something we call gamma. It's a digital image term, and a simple way to think of gamma is that it gives us a way to adjust the brightness range of all of the pixels in an image simultaneously. If images were like rock music on our radios, gamma is like the volume knob on your radio. When you turn down the volume, you still hear heavier sounds like drum beats, but lighter sounds like the background singers will fade out. To illustrate this analogy, let's turn down the volume on Glenn's image. We'll start with a gamma of 1 and reduce that by half, which does give it a more dramatic look. Also, see how the darker corner pixels are beginning to go away. Then by stepping down half again to 0.25, even more of those corner pixels begin to fade away. However, while the brighter pixels in the center become darker as well, they nonetheless continue to hold their own. That is, until we cut the gamma down to 0.10. At this point, we're seeing some very stark differences. And when we take that all away down to a gamma of 0.01, all we have left are the brightest objects. Our rock and roll drum beats, so to speak, the hot objects in the sky, if you will. With that, we're ready to rock on to the next stage in our gamma test of Glenn's image using brightness and contrast. And that brings us to an interesting thought. We've all heard the truism, what goes up must come down. Well, with gamma testing, the opposite is true. What goes down must come up, and I'm going to show that to you right now. The next step in our analysis is to reduce brightness to a value of -1. And while our hot objects still persist, they are beginning to fade away. The question is, will they all fade out together, or will some fade out sooner than others? To test for that, we reduce brightness to a value of -2. And what we see is that our hot objects are fading out together. That's a good sign. So let's take it to the next step. Here we've reduced brightness to a value of -3. What we see now is that all of our hot objects have faded out together. Is it time to break out the champagne and celebrate? Sorry, but no. Remember, with gamma testing, what goes down must come up. To test for that, we use contrast. Here, we've increased the contrast level to +1, while the previous settings for brightness and gamma remain unchanged. Now we're seeing the same objects fade in again. So let's take it to the final step. When we increase the contrast level to +2, we see our hot objects fade in together, just as they previously faded out together. So, what went down did come up, which means that our hot objects are genuine. Now you know how easy it is to use a gamma test to cut the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, when it comes to image analysis. So download some images yourself and have fun with them. Then before you know it, you'll start doing more advanced tests on your own, like luminance testing. When we performed a luminance test on Glenn's image, it had a rather interesting result. So let's take a look at that. In simple terms, luminance is the luminous intensity of a surface in a given direction, and we use it to see if a hot object is behind or in front of the sun. With this in mind, let's return to Glenn's image. Here we see the original image, with the image values as defined by Glenn's camera. For the purpose of this luminance test, we'll set brightness at +4, keep the contrast as is, and reduce gamma to 0.01. The first thing we notice with this setting is the background luminance of the clouds. We call this background luminance because the sun is behind the clouds, which is why there is a bright halo around the top edges of the clouds shown here. Conversely, when we look at our object of interest, what we're seeing is foreground luminance. In other words, we are seeing its daylight side because it is behind the sun. This also tells us this object is not a reflection because reflections occur between the sun and the camera sensor, and were our object a reflection, it would not appear this way. Also, the wings on our object are clearly being illuminated by the sun. So, when we look at Glenn's image with luminance testing, we see that our object of interest is behind the sun and that the clouds are in front of it. Now let's see what Glenn has to say.
having seen that, what is your thoughts as a former digital photography instructor?
I think you're right on. You identified the luminance of both the sun and what I call the second sun, the Nibiru. And the
Okay.
luminance is similar, so I think you're right on.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, Glenn, we really appreciate you coming on and making this report. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
At the beginning of the program, I told you that I found Glenn's image to be deeply disturbing, and I'm going to explain why a little later on in the program. But right now we have a brief message for those of you out there building shelters about an inexpensive way to enhance your solar storm shielding. Planning and preparation is often a heuristic process of trial and error. And sometimes learning what hurts and learning what works can be a little trying. That's the reason why the best way to smooth out the process is always look for a low-tech solution. Low-tech is a strategy I always promote in my relocation webinars because we live in a high-tech consumer society. And so we naturally tend to go high-tech and to look for ways to save money. A case in point is how we build our underground shelters, many of which are not buried deep enough for the threats we face in the coming tribulation. In my recent interview with David South, founder of Monolithic Domes of Paris, Texas, we talked about EMP protection. And what he advised is that you cover your shelter with a minimum of 5 feet of dirt. If you are preparing to survive an EMP event, such as that described in the book 1 Second After, 5 feet of dirt is adequate for a conventional WMD threat matrix. By the way, the scenario in that bestseller is an EMP attack on the United States with just 2 sea-launched medium-range missiles. Not only does this devastate our high-tech computer society, it reduces our population by 90%. Keep this in mind because we're facing a pole shift event with EMPs and much, much worse. This is because in the coming tribulation we are going to have solar storms that are going to be much worse than nuclear devices being detonated overhead. In other words, instead of 5 feet of dirt over your shelter, you need twice that. So why is this? According to remote viewing instructor Major Ed Dames, during the coming flyby there will be an event he calls the kill shot. This event will happen as Nibiru passes between Earth and the Sun, during a time commonly referred to in Bible prophecy as the days of darkness. Before and after this transit, the Sun will unleash horrific solar storms, and many of these could scorch the surface of our planet. This is what Ed's remote viewing teams began seeing after the turn of the millennium, and in 2004, Ed released his video, The Kill Shot. Back in 2004, Ed's publicist sent me a copy of The Kill Shot, and I watched it. It impressed me and I put it away for safekeeping. Then, over a decade later, in April of this year, a generous donor made it possible for me to attend one of Ed's remote viewing classes in Reno. At the first break, I went up to Ed and introduced myself. Ed recognized me and said, "I've heard your name many times before." And then I told him that I watched his kill shot video for the second time the night before the class, and that the first time I watched it was in 2004. And I said, "Ed, you're consistent with everything we're seeing. You got it right in 2004. On a broad brush basis, you nailed it." And that didn't make him happy. We were both actually sad to have that realization. Since then, one of the things that has been on my mind is that I see a lot of people building bunkers without enough EMP and solar storm protection. Piling on dirt is one thing, if you can do it. But if your structure cannot take the added weight, well, that's not going to work. And if you do not have enough protection when the days of darkness happen, you and your loved ones could become the proverbial poodles in the microwave. For this reason, I started looking for a way to up-armor, if you will, a shallow, dug-in shelter for added EMP protection. The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is steel plates, such as the ones road crews use to temporarily cover potholes in the road. The problem is they are expensive, especially if you need to cover a large area. So, is there a way to get the same level of protection, but with something far less expensive? Yes, there is. Richard Shafsky, who authored an article we published in September 2015 titled Geoengineering Volcanoes to Rain Death Down Upon Us, told me about an alternative to steel plate that inch for inch offers as much EMP protection, but at a fraction of the cost and with less weight. It's called volcanic basalt. Basalt is the most common bedrock on our planet, and it most commonly forms as an extrusive rock where continental plates come together or pull apart. It is also formed in volcanic lava flows, such as those deposited by the ancient eruptions of the Yellowstone supervolcano. So, finding basalt for your shelter is not difficult. In fact, basalt is so common you can find it elsewhere in our solar system. For example, basalt is an abundant rock on the moon, where large areas of the moon have been resurfaced by extensive basalt flows triggered by major impact events. Then there is Olympus Mons, a shield volcano on Mars. Olympus Mons is the highest mountain on Mars and was formed from basaltic lava flows. In fact, if you think Yellowstone is a whopper, Olympus Mons is the largest known volcano in our solar system. Here on Earth, basalt is used in a wide range of commercial and military electromagnetic radiation absorption applications, such as radiation shielding, concrete, and fiber. This is because basalt has a higher content of iron and magnesium than granites, and it is paramagnetic. In simple terms, any substance that will move towards a magnet is paramagnetic, which means it exhibits paramagnetism, a form of magnetism that occurs only in the presence of an externally applied magnetic field. Studies of old volcanic basalt are proof that Earth's magnetic poles reverse at irregular intervals, ranging from tens of thousands to millions of years. In the coming tribulation, we'll experience a magnetic shift where the north and south poles exchange places, in addition to a physical pole shift. And then there will be solar storms the likes of which we cannot imagine. So the more we can do to protect our shelters, the better. And basalt is a great way to do that. That's why I was fortunate to learn about basalt from Richard Shafsky while visiting Montana. He explained the impressive paramagnetic properties of basalt to me and then introduced me to basalt quarry owner John Fanuzzi. In terms of solar storm protection, John explained to me why basalt is a low-cost alternative to metallic solutions. And so I asked him to give us this brief report for those of you out there building shelters. So let's see what John has to say.
Hi everyone, my name is John Fanuzzi and I'm an owner of a basalt rock quarry, and this particular basalt material is not just any kind of rock. It's volcanic rock. It comes from the core of the earth, has all the minerals that are very, very valuable compared to just regular rock. This particular rock is going to give us very good protection during the Planet X flyover from radiation, solar flares, electromagnetic pulse, everything you would need to cover your shelter in this dangerous time. I'd like to show you what this rock can become. This is basalt fiber that has been extruded out of molten basalt. Don't forget, basalt comes from the heart of the earth as lava. It flows. It melts at about 17 or 1800 degrees, and when it's melted, it can be extruded through platinum bushings and turned into this very fine fiber that's thinner than your hair. Fiber can be woven into a fabric that could be laminated into material for stealth aircraft. It could be it's used by a company here locally making backpacks that are bulletproof. Be laminated together for bulletproof shielding. It could be used for any application where that requires high heat fiber, high heat tolerance fiber. For those of you who have already built your shelter and have inadequate amount of soil over covering, I would highly suggest using basalt as an additive, maybe 3 to 6 inches of basalt in the form of basalt tailings, which could be purchased inexpensively from a basalt quarry, or a combination of aggregate with the tailings. The basalt is probably the most practical, economical, and available construction material for Planet X to fly over. It's going to be high performance, and it's not going to cost you a ton of money.
I really appreciate John coming on and explaining basalt to us. And when you do order it, you can save money by getting the tailings, which are going to cost you less than the aggregate, or a combination of the two. Not only is basalt great for solar storm shielding, there's other uses for it as well. Earlier, I mentioned my cut-to-the-chase interview with David South, co-inventor of monolithic concrete domes, which happen to require a good deal of rebar in order to make. What David shared with us in that interview should be of particular interest to all shelter builders. If you're planning on building your shelters with steel rebar, there is a better way to go according to Dave, and for the same price as steel. Dave told us he's using basalt rebar these days to build his domes instead of steel. According to Dave, basalt rebar is stronger, lighter, corrosion resistant, and longer lasting than steel. Another benefit of basalt is that it is stealthy. It's why our military uses woven basalt for that very reason. So for you shelter builders out there, look into what basalt can do for you, because it's a great way to inexpensively protect your shelters from solar storms. And now we're going to take a second look at Glenn Vaughan's image, the one with the wings on Nibiru. And I'm going to explain to you why I find that image to be deeply, deeply disturbing. The question about Planet X I hear most often from people is, when will I see it? And here's where Planet X has the same problem as ufology, where you have mountains of photographic evidence, but until someone sees an extraterrestrial or a UFO for the first time, they're not going to believe it. Well, the same thing holds true with Planet X. This is why the easiest way to stop most people from preparing is to tell them when they'll see it with their own two eyes, because that's when procrastination sets in. Or they'll just wait to buy into the government mantra about not having to worry because nothing serious will happen during the flyby. That's why for me there's only one relevant question. How long do I have to prepare? And this is why I find Glenn's image to be deeply disturbing. It tells me that our window of opportunity is closing, and to understand why, let's take a closer look at that image. Here is Glenn's original image, and here is our winged object of interest. In our luminance analysis, we saw that this object is behind the sun and not in front of it like the halos on the cloud tops. So with that in mind, let's take a closer look at our winged object. Here we see our winged object of interest and illustration 112 from Zecharia Sitchin's book, The 12th Planet. And in the upper right, a Nibiru graphic we often see on the web. Therefore, the object of interest in Glenn's picture appears to be Nibiru, which means it's only a matter of time before everyone in the world will be pointing up the sky and realizing that they're not prepared for what they're finally seeing with their own two eyes. So is that time closer at hand now? Well, we're seeing Nibiru's wings for the very first time. But why is it? Why are we seeing them now and not before? According to Zecharia Sitchin, Nibiru translates to the planet of crossing. But crossing from where? In the first video in this series, Planet X System Update Number 1, we presented the Planet X system as described in my book, Being in It for the Species, where Nibiru is part of a mini-constellation in orbit around our Sun. At the heart of this mini-constellation is a small brown dwarf star called Nemesis by modern astronomers, with 3 major planets. By size, they are Nibiru, a rocky planet several times the size of the Earth, then a small gaseous planet named Helion, with its own moon Harrington, and finally another rocky planet called Arbota. In this illustration, we see that Helion is the first major planet in orbit around Nemesis, Arbota is the second, and Nibiru the third. Here's why Nibiru is called the planet of crossing in the ancient texts, because it is in the furthermost orbit away from Nemesis, which means of the 3, it will come closest to the Earth. So, how close is close? In this illustration, we see the Planet X system overlapped onto the orbits of Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and Jupiter. This gives us an approximate idea of the overall size of the Planet X system in comparison to our own. And this brings us to the Nibiru wings we see in Glenn's image captured in April 2015. To understand this a little better, let's take a look at comets. The 2 tails we see streaming behind the comet shown here are dust and gas. The smaller dust tail trails the comet in its orbit. However, the larger and more spectacular gas tail is like a weather vane. It follows the solar wind away from the sun. And what is important to note is that this distinctive gas tail is not always visible. That is, until the comet's orbit brings it inside the orbit of Jupiter. That's when the sun's light is bright enough to warm the comet and to cause it to outgas. And this is what gives us those brilliant gas tails. This is not to say Nibiru is a comet. It is not. However, what Glenn's winged object of interest does suggest is that as of April of this year, the orbit of Nibiru, the outermost planet of the Planet X system, is now close enough to the sun that the sun's light is bright enough and strong enough to be reflected by the particles in Nibiru's tail, which, when viewed head-on, appear like wings. Assuming this is so, where would that place the smaller Planet X system inside our own larger solar system, given that it is presently approaching from the opposite side of the sun as seen from Earth? Given the winged appearance of Nibiru, that places the planet of crossing, as the ancients called it, between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter. As to Nemesis, the brown dwarf companion star at the core of the Planet X system, this would place it between the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn. If this is truly the case, then there would be some form of empirical data that would corroborate this assumption. There is. In September 2015, Space.com published an article titled, "Something Strange is Happening Inside Saturn," which states, "Unusual ripples in Saturn's rings are revealing the mysterious inner workings of the great gas giant. Waves caused by the moons, which orbit outside the ring's sphere, always travel outward. But then there's a set of waves heading inward. That means there's something moving inside, too. So in other words, phrases like something strange and unusual ripples tells us this is a new development. And that is important because Saturn is one of the most studied planets in our system. So it stands to reason that if a brown dwarf star is passing through Saturn's region of space, these unusual ripples could very well be the result of a distant gravitational interaction between Saturn's rings and Nemesis. Are Saturn's unusual ripples a sign that Nemesis, the approaching companion of Sol and the smaller sun in our binary system, is now actually between Jupiter and Saturn? That is for you and you alone to decide. That brings us to the next question. Is there any corroborative data that would show that Nibiru could be inside the orbit of Jupiter? To answer that question, we need to come a little closer to home. If the rings of Saturn are subject to unusual ripples, then what about our own planet, Earth? Are there harbinger events happening here as well? Yes, and this was predicted long ago and noted in Zecharia Sitchin's book, The 12th Planet. This time the translation is not by Sitchin, but by another translator noted in The 12th Planet. We find it on page 242 of the 1978 Avon paperback edition, where Sitchin begins with, "The nearing planet was expected to cause rains and flooding, as its strong gravitational effects have been known to do. According to the ancient Mesopotamian text as translated by R. Campbell Thompson, when the planets of the throne of heaven will grow brighter, there will be floods and rains. When Nibiru attains its perigee, rains and floods will come." In this translation, we find the term perigee. This term refers to the closest distance any body comes to planet Earth. So does this translation match with what happens each time Nibiru attains perigee, its closest point to the Earth? No. This is because the effects of Nibiru on the Earth vary from one flyby to the next. For example, the last flyby was Exodus, which was a best-case scenario. A best-case scenario is where Earth is on the opposite side of the Sun when Nibiru reaches perigee. On the other hand, Noah's flood was a Planet X worst-case scenario. A worst-case scenario is where Earth is on the same side of the Sun when Nibiru reaches perigee. So, what will this flyby be? In a Project Camelot interview recorded in September 2008, former military intelligence officer and government whistleblower Bob Dean predicted a worst-case scenario for us. Everything we've seen since 2008 tells us that Bob Dean called it right. We are facing a worst-case scenario flyby, and there will be a pole shift. So is this consistent with the Mesopotamian prediction that there will be rains and floods? Yes, that is, if you are reading current science headlines. Scientists, natural disasters becoming more common. Global cost of flooding to increase tenfold by 2030. Global flood toll to triple by 2030. Flooding, devastating floods and heavy rains. Heavy flooding and global warming. Is there a connection? Yes, folks, the implications of Glenn Vaughan's Nibiru wings image are disturbing. But what saddens me more is that if people wait to see Nibiru with their own two eyes before they choose to act, they are playing into what the elites have planned for the many billions they call useless eaters. And if you're in awareness, you already know that. That's why I have a special message for my brothers and sisters in awareness, one that may bring you hope and a renewed sense of purpose. For well over a decade, I have communicated with hundreds, if not thousands, of my brothers and sisters in awareness. And what I find interesting about you is that you usually tend to be between the ages of 45 to 65, and most of you have been in awareness since you were children. For most of you, your life is like a solitary candle pushing back the darkness, seldom meeting your many brothers and sisters in awareness. You do not know them, but they, like you, are alone in the dark. Each of you sees the lonely light of your truth pushing back in the darkness. But because of what I do, I see your many candles as a vibrant collection of heavenly lights pushing back the darkness, and bound to each other by a noble purpose. The purpose for which you incarnated, not just to survive, but to make a difference. I know this must sound difficult because for many of you, being in awareness these days is like walking amongst the unhealed and uncaring as a healer who cannot heal yourself. If you are seeking recognition and acceptance, this will not heal you, for your mission is that of a truth bearer. And yes, you can make a difference. Back in 2008, paid disinformation operatives began using the term sundogs as a neuro-linguistic trigger to program people's minds against Planet X awareness. Back then, I often spoke out about this on my website and in media interviews, but to be honest, I was not the one who denied the elites the fruits of this powerful mind control tool. It was the people who live in sparsely populated regions of the country, places like western Minnesota, where sundogs are frequently seen. What happened was that these people began showing up in chat rooms and social media sites, and they began correcting people who were using the term sundogs incorrectly. And God bless them, they were pleasantly persistent, and by 2010, the term sundogs as an NLP trigger fell out of use. Now, in observing them, I realized three things that could make a difference. The first is that the elites are not invincible. Second, people respect the truth. And thirdly, pleasant persistence works. Of these three things, pleasant persistence is the most important. It is the key to success, and we see it at work in other ways as well. Imagine a lonely lighthouse along a rocky shoreline. Night after night it shines its light with pleasant persistence to warn passing ships of danger. There is never any applause for these determined lighthouse keepers, and yet each night they light the light, knowing full well they'll never hear those distant whispers of thanks from the wise captains at sea who take heed and change course. Like a lonely lighthouse keeper, yours is a solitary job as well, with only an occasional visit from someone who respects you for what you do. So, how can you make peace with that reality? By believing that in time your purpose in the coming tribulation will be made clear to you, and that you will be appreciated by those you can heal, and this will heal you as well. But until that day arrives, You have the opportunity to lead a purposeful and satisfying life in awareness, because now you have a choice. You can continue to be a lonely candle pushing back the darkness, or you can become a lighthouse to the world, where the light of your truth can deny the elites the fruits of their lies, wherever you may find them on the internet. Just remember, when you challenge their lies with truth, always do so with pleasant persistence, and you will make a difference. Above all else, my brothers and sisters in awareness, know this. I have felt your pain of isolation. I have felt your despair. It is why I have chosen to be a lighthouse unto you, and the truth of my light is that you are not alone. And I'll leave it on that note. So until the next time we meet, remember Marshall's motto: destiny comes to those who listen, and fate finds the rest. So learn what you can learn, do what you can do, and never give up hope. This is Marshall, and I'll catch you on the backside.